Welcome back to Atoma Rejects. Today we're going to be looking at this immense pile of weapons. Darktide is a game with an enormous arsenal to choose from, and it can be a real challenge knowing what each mark of each weapon can do. But this commissar is here to show you the strengths, weaknesses, perks, and blessings of each melee weapon available to the veteran class. If there's a specific weapon you want to know more about, check the timestamps below. Part 2 of this little mini-series will be looking at all of the ranged weapons available to the veteran class, while Part 3 is going to focus on talents and constructing builds. If you want to graduate to an Auric level operative, or if you're a seasoned veteran looking for new inspiration, please like and subscribe for more Darktide content. Lastly, let me know in the comments what build or class you'd like to see next. There will also be polls on my channel. With that all out of the way, let's go ahead and get started. There's a lot to get through. We're going to start off by looking at the combat axes. These are fantastic general purpose weapons that really excel at dealing with hordes and isolated elite enemies, but they can absolutely chunk through big groups of elites, although some elites they handle better than others. For the modifiers, they have damage, mobility, penetration, finesse, and first target on the Rashad and the Achilles, with the Antax subbing out finesse for cleave targets. This means it's going to be a little bit better at dealing with hordes compared to the other two, but lacking finesse means that you're going to be having a little bit less attack speed and a little bit less crit damage out of the Antax compared to the other two. In the interest of keeping these as similar as possible when it is appropriate, I would say for the perks you're going to want to take plus flak damage since it's the most common armor type in the game, and then plus elite damage as your second perk. There are a few other options you can sub out instead of elite damage, like you can go with stamina or unyielding are good examples, but that's really going to be up to you and your playstyle and what threats you want your axe to be able to deal with well. For our blessings, all three combat axes are going to need brutal momentum. This blessing is really what lets the axes do their job, and without it you're going to really struggle to make it work as a melee weapon. The extra weak spot damage is nice, but the main reason we're taking it is because weak spot kills also ignore enemy hit mass. This lets you cleave through different targets and kind of spread out the damage of the axe a lot more than you're going to be able to otherwise. To pair up with it, I like to take Decapitator, especially on the Rashad and the Achilles, because the added finesse bonus is just going to give us more attack speed and more critical strike chance. For the Antax, I would recommend either Head Taker, Decimator, or Shred. It's really just going to depend on your playstyle. I like using Shred because I find that the crits kind of help me cleave through a bunch of enemies, and with Brutal Momentum, crits are going to do a lot more damage on cleave than otherwise. But if you want to run one of these other options, feel free, they should work really well. Now let's go over the moveset for each of the combat axes, now that you've gotten the overview and you know what perks and blessings work best on them. So we'll start out with the Rashad. So the Rashad is going to have this kind of horizontal swipe pattern to it, with that one body swing coming in from right to left at the end. And just like this. The heavy attacks are going to be overhead swings that are going to be very good at dealing with things like crushers or maulers. But the push attack, or push block attack, as you can see here, basically you're hitting with the flat part of the axe, so it doesn't do much damage, but it does have pretty good stagger, and it will go through a horde to kind of stagger the whole horde. So a typical attack pattern with the Rashad is going to be light attack, light attack, light attack, push block, light attack, light attack, light attack. And you're just going to keep that up until whatever's in front of you is dead. If you come up against a harder opponent like a crusher, you're going to instead want to go for top-down strikes mixed in with push block attacks. The push block attacks are still going to be important, so you can stagger the something like the mauler and prevent it from, chopping your head off with that big old chain axe it has there. I wish we could have that one. For the special attack on the Rashad, it's kind of like a golf swing. As you can see here, it swings up from the floor into the target. And it doesn't do much damage at all, even on an enemy like this. You can see it's only doing like 230 damage. But it does have a good amount of stagger on it, and if you can hit things in the head with it, it will stagger them pretty much most of the time. I personally don't use the special attack on the Rashad very often because I just don't feel like it's super necessary when you can just push block attack instead. But it is good to know that it exists, and maybe it'll save your life one time. Another thing you can do is you can kind of time it. If a Poxhound is jumping at you, you can swing up and knock the Poxhound out of the air. But that's the Rashad, so let's look at the Antax. For the Antax axe, it's pretty much identical to the Rashad in its moveset. The only real difference is its special weapon attack. So as you can see here, it's a couple of horizontal swipes followed by that body height swing horizontally. So if we're going through the enemies like that, that's going to be your attack pattern. Same with the Rashad. You're going to do light attack, light attack, light attack, push block. I did a heavy attack there because it's a mauler. But basically, light attack, light attack, light attack, push block, attack, and repeat. You do this, you're going to cleave through pretty much any horde. Now the Antax, its special attack, I think is a lot better than the Rashad or the Achilles. They share a very similar special attack. But the Antax, you're going to stab straight forward. And as you can see, it does a lot of stagger if you hit something in the head. So if you have a mauler that's about to crush you with its overhead swing, just stab him in the head. It'll stagger him, and you can finish him off with heavy attacks. So that's the Antax. Let's move on to the Achilles. Now the Achilles has a much different attack pattern than the other two combat axes. Its light attacks are mostly over the shoulder, and then it has that one kind of diagonal swing as the second attack. But the first and the third attack are going to be coming directly over your shoulder. The push block attack is the same as the Rashad's. As you can see, when I push block, it's hitting it with the flat end of the axe. So your typical attack pattern is going to be light attack, light attack, light attack, push block, attack. That's usually how I like to do it, but with the Achilles specifically, it's actually okay to just do 2 hits, then push block and move, because you need to reposition that top-down swing. Otherwise, it is very difficult to hit targets with this weapon. I don't run this combat axe very often because of that problem, but it's just something worth noting. If you like it, it is really good at mulching hordes as long as you can position yourself well. For its heavy attacks, it also has a little bit of a difference. It doesn't only have the top-down strike, it also has a horizontal swing with that spiked end of the axe. Now, I'm not a big fan of this attack because it has almost no penetration at all. It will get stuck in whatever first enemy you hit with it, unless it actually kills them for brutal momentum to kick in. But after that first horizontal attack, the follow-up attacks are all vertical strike down patterns, just like the others. So now that we've gone over the combat axes, let's get into the tactical axes. The tac axes are a bit of an underrated choice on veteran. For their modifiers, they have damage, penetration, finesse, critical strike bonus, and mobility, with mobility being our dump stat. We want that crit bonus to be as high as possible. This is just a tac axe I got from the Emperor gift, so the critical bonus is fairly low, but we really want finesse, penetration, critical bonus, and damage to be as high as possible, so we're dumping mobility. For our perks, we're going to want to take flak damage, again, because it's the most common type in the game. And for the second perk, you can take a couple of different options. I like to use either stamina or critical strike chance on the veteran. Having the extra crit chance just really lets us make the most of that crit bonus, because the crit bonus on the tac axes is very, very high. It's very similar to the knife. Crits are your lifeblood when you're using a tactical axe. The light attack patterns are going to be doing most of the damage to elites, while your heavy attacks are mostly how you're going to deal with hordes, heavy attacks, and push block attacks. So the tac axe has you covered for really whatever you need to do. I'd actually very much encourage veterans to try tac axes more, because I think they're very underrated. For the blessings, we're going to stick with brutal momentum for the same reason as the combat axes. And for our second choice on veteran, I really like to run shred, again to make the most out of that crit bonus. Between shred and crit as one of our perks, we can get up to 25% crit chance just on our weapon alone, not accounting for talents or anything like that. And with the fast attack speed of the tactical axes, those crits are going to be coming out very hard and very fast. Some other options, if you don't have access to Shred, would be Head Taker and Decimator. These both give you good amounts of stacking power on repeated hits, so they pair really well with the tac axe's fast attacks. For the movesets, we're going to start out with the Atrox Mark II. This is my favorite version of the tactical axe, mostly because of its attack patterns, which is really the only difference between all the axes. For the attack pattern for the light attacks, we're going for a strike down, vanguard, strike down pattern. This is really good for dealing with big single enemies like maulers. You can kind of just spam it, aim for their head, and they'll die pretty quickly. For the heavy attacks, we got vanguard style attacks, which is fantastic for cleaving through hordes. And for the push block, we have another vanguard style attack that does the same damage as our heavy attack. So a good attack pattern for dealing with, say, groups of gunners would be to go push, block, attack, light attack, spam. And you just kind of repeat that until everything around you is dead. If you're dealing with hordes, we're going to be going with push block attacks into heavy attacks. The heavy attacks are very fast, as you can see with the tactical axes, so you can really kind of spam your way through hordes. Just mix in push block attacks when needed. For the special attacks, you're going to be flipping the axe to the hammer side of it, and it does a lot of stagger, but as you can see, it doesn't do nearly as much damage as the light attacks. So usually what you use this for is if, a bruiser's about to hit you or a mauler's about to hit you, you just kind of bop them on the head a few times, and that'll interrupt their attack pattern, so then you can go back to spamming those light attacks. So that's the Atrox Mark II. Let's look at the Mark IV. Next up is the Mark IV Atrox Tactical Axe, and this one is pretty different from the Mark II because its light attack pattern is all vanguards. There's no strike downs in this attack pattern, which does make it a little bit better at dealing with hordes because you don't have to aim as hard at heads, but it does kind of suffer with its heavy attacks, which is a strike down into a strike up. I'm not a big fan of the strike up because it is pretty difficult to hit heads with it sometimes. So a lot of times what you're going to be doing with the Mark IV is just spamming these light attacks mixed in with the push block attacks, which are the same across all the tactical axes. For its special attack, it's pretty much the same in function to the Mark II, if not in form. You're basically shoving the axe in their face, but you're going to be using this the same way. So, if this mauler's about to bop me, I'm just going to spam him a little bit and then go back to using my light attacks to bring him down. So that's the Mark IV. Next up, let's look at the Mark VII. Last, we have the Mark VII Tactical Axe. This one's attack pattern is kind of a mix of the previous two. Instead of having the strike down at the start, it has a it does have a strike down and then vanguard, vanguard, rather than strike down, vanguard, strike down, like the Mark II. The heavy attacks are a vanguard and then an overhead swing. And then the push attack is the same as the other tactical axes. It just comes from the other side it comes from the left rather than the right. Its special attack is the same as the Mark IV. You're just kind of shoving it in their face. The attack pattern might be slightly different, but like I said before, this is pretty much what you use it for. Just interrupt things that are about to bonk you. When you're dealing with elite enemies with the Mark VII, I would recommend you mostly use the light attack spam because it is pretty easy to hit heads with it. You can throw in a couple of heavy attacks if you want to, but mostly you're going to be using light attacks and push block attacks to get the most damage out of these weapons. By the way, if y'all are curious, some of these weapons are going to be grays, so they're not doing as much damage, but I promise if you buff them up and put the perks on it, they are pretty damn good axes. Now, let's move on to the next set of weapons. Next up, we have the Orestes chain axes. These got a pretty big glow up recently, and they both have their niche despite having very different attack patterns. Thankfully, they do share the same modifiers, being damage, penetration, defenses, shredder, and mobility. Defenses is going to determine the amount of stamina it costs to use your push and your push block attack, and also it affects your dodge distance. Shredder is a modifier that determines how much damage your weapon's special ability will do. This is true for all the chain weapon variants. Shredder is going to affect, like when you press that special weapon activation and start sawing into an enemy, that's what determines how much damage it does. I see some people dumping Shredder, but I do think that's probably a mistake. I don't think that the mobility is that useful in comparison. So, if you want to dump Shredder, you can, but I wouldn't recommend it. For the perks and blessings, since they have vastly different attack patterns between the Mark IV and the Mark XII, I think it's appropriate to run slightly different things. The Orestes Mark IV is going to be relying more on its light attacks, whereas the Mark XII is going to be using its heavy attacks to deal with heavy armored targets. So for the Mark IV, we're going to take flak damage and elite damage. You can swap out elite for unyielding or stamina if you want to. It doesn't really matter. And for the blessings on the Mark IV, we're taking Slaughterer with Thunderous. I like Thunderous because you're mostly going to be using the light attacks with it, so it's really easy to apply that brittleness onto a target and help kill heavily armored things. For the Mark XII, we're going to be using flak damage and unyielding because it kind of makes it into more of a boss-killing weapon, especially when combined with our blessings, which are Slaughterer and Thrust. If you don't have either of these blessings, you can swap them out for things like Head Taker or Bloodletter. These are both fairly good blessings. I just think they're a little less optimal than the ones I've shown here. But if these are what you have, feel free to use them. Now let's look at the attack patterns for both of these chain axes. Starting out with the Orestes Mark IV chain axe, this is a very interesting weapon because there's no other weapon quite like it, and I'll show you why. When you do the light attacks, the axe is going to bite into the target, just on the light attacks. I'm not using the special ability at all. So this is great for dealing with elite enemies, and it does do a lot of damage, as you can see. But it does kind of run into problems when you're dealing with chaff, because you kind of have to wait for that animation to stop to get the full benefit of the damage. You can just keep swinging through, but as you can see, even when I'm swinging through, it's kind of getting stuck on each enemy. So to get around that, what you're going to do dealing with light enemies like chaff is you're going to be using the light attacks into push block attacks very frequently. You got to be using that push block attack a lot with both versions of the chain axe, because it just gives you the space you need to be able to actually swing the thing. And for the Orestes Mark IV, it has this really nice sweep attack with the push block. So what I like to do, especially when I'm dealing with chaff, is go from a push block into heavy attacks. Because on the Mark IV, the heavy attacks don't get stuck with the chain. They don't activate the chain on it. So you can actually cleave through hordes pretty nicely. It doesn't do insane amounts of damage. This one I'm showing you currently is a gray weapon, so it has no blessings or perks or anything. But it does do a lot of damage, and you can set up these heavy attacks with those push block attacks. Lastly, the weapon activation, the special ability, revs the chain axe, so when you strike next, it will do a very big cut into them, and this is where that shredder stat comes into play. The higher the shredder stat, the more damage that this special weapon attack will do. And typically, it does do more damage when you charge it with a heavy swing than it will with a light swing. But yeah, this is the Orestes Mark IV. This is what it can do. I don't typically prefer this one, but if you like it, feel free. It is still a very good weapon, and you can absolutely make it work. So let's move on to the Mark XII. So this is the Orestes Mark XII pattern, and I absolutely love this thing. You'll notice this will do substantially more damage, but that's because this is a fully upgraded and, kitted out axe that I use in my own games. It's not a gray weapon. But for the attack patterns with the light attacks, as you notice, it does not bite into the opponent. It just kind of swings. This makes it fantastic for dealing with hordes or even just chaff enemies. You see, it still has that great stagger on it. It's got a lot of good penetration, like it will go through many enemies at the same time without any kind of other blessings or supplemental things. It just comes with the weapon. But the heavy attacks do bite. So when you throw in those heavy attacks, you'll see it kind of bites into the opponent and does that extra shredder damage. Now for the rev attack, it's very much the same as the other one, but it does this in the strike down rather than the from side to side. And as you'll notice, it is doing substantially more damage, but like I said, it's because this has fully kitted out perks and blessings on it. But that's the moveset. The push block attack. Oh, I do need to mention the push block attack. Push block attack on this pattern, the Orestes 12, is amazing. It's a stab forward, which you wouldn't normally like for a weapon like this, but it does ridiculous damage. As you can see with the stagger from the push and just poking this dude in the face, it's doing a lot of damage. So make sure you actually run a stamina curio or two when you use either of these weapons. They are very stamina hungry. But now, let's get into the next set. Chainswords. These are relatively similar between the marks. We have the Mark IV and the Mark 13G. Mark 13G is a new addition with the latest patch of the Trader's Curse Part 2. For the modifiers, they share the same ones, which is damage, penetration, finesse, shredder, and mobility. Once again, we're going to be dumping mobility. You can more easily dump shredder with the chain swords because you're not usually using them as a veteran to kill big heavy targets, so shredder's not as important as it is with the chain axes, but I'd still recommend dumping mobility. For the perks, we're going to be using the same on both, which is going to be flak and elite damage. I find that these weapons really excel at dealing with mixed hordes, so kind of highlighting that by making sure that we're doing the most damage to flak, which is the most common armor type in the game, and elites, which are going to be mixed in with the hordes, is usually a good way to go. If you want to swap one of those out for unyielding or stamina or something else, feel free. It's not that important. I just feel like when you're using this as a mixed horde clearing weapon, these are probably the best perks to go for. For the blessings, we have a few options, but I really like Rampage and Wrath. This again just highlights that kind of mixed horde killing power, with Wrath giving us cleave on hit, and Rampage giving us more damage when we hit 3 or more enemies. And it's a pretty substantial amount, 24 to 30% damage. For alternative blessings, I can recommend Shred or Bloodletter. These both do help the Chainswords with doing their job. Shred is particularly good because it has finesse on it, so just further increasing that crit damage when we do get crits can be a good way to go. Bloodletter is also a good way to kind of turn it into a pseudo boss killing weapon. You're not going to be killing bosses solely with bleed, but it can help a little bit. So if you want to run one of these other two options, feel free. They both will work. I would recommend subbing out Rampage for them. Wrath or some kind of cleave blessing is kind of important when you're running the Chainsword, because we really want it to be able to hack through hordes with ease. So now let's look at the moveset. First, we'll take a look at the Cadia Mark IV. This is the OG Chainsword. This is the one that came out with the base game. And it's got a pretty nice attack pattern. It's very easy to use. It's going to be an overhead swing followed by Vanguard and then a horizontal attack. So as you can see, overhead, Vanguard, horizontal. This makes it ideal for dealing with chaff because you don't really have to aim with it at all. You can just kind of walk forward and spam light attacks and things will die. But with the heavy attacks, I do like to use it if I'm truly surrounded. Like if I'm really struggling and the light attacks aren't killing things fast enough, what I'll do is I'll do a push into heavy attacks. Because these heavy attacks, they don't do as much damage as the light attacks, weirdly, but they do have that predictable wide pattern. So if you need to make space for yourself, that's how I would do it. Lastly, the push block attack is not something you're going to be using. You will use it a lot, but you're not going to rely on it too much because it's just a stab forward. It does do decent damage, especially on a crit, but it's not really going to be killing anything that's worthwhile, and it's obviously not going to help much against hordes. So really just, if you go with the push block, I would just follow it up with light attacks for, optimal carnage. Now let's look at the Mark 13G. This is the Cadia Mark 13G, and it's the new edition with the Trader's Curse Part 2. And I really like it because its moveset is pretty easy to use, and it has one extra move that the Cadia Mark IV does not have. So for the light attack patterns, it's going to be a strike down into an upward vanguard, downward vanguard, and then another vanguard attack. So what this means is that it's even better at going through the hordes like this because you have that extra swing in the light attack pattern to cover more area. So you're not going to find yourself in that situation of getting mobbed by poxwalkers as often. It also helps that the push block attack is it's a vanguard swipe, so it also clears more area than the stab attack of the Mark IV. For the heavy attacks, it's going to be overhead swings like this. It'll hit from one from each side, one from the right, one from the middle, one from the left. And whenever you use the chain attack, I would always recommend that you use the heavy attack with the Mark 13G, because the first attack after you activate it is going to be a downward hit anyway. So if you're going to be downward hitting anyway, you might as well just take that extra quarter of a second to charge up that heavy attack for optimal damage. So now let's move into the Catachan knives. So for the Catachan combat blades, we have the Mark VI and the Mark III. These also have very drastically different attack patterns, but thankfully they share the same modifiers, being damage, penetration, finesse, first target, and mobility. Mobility will be our dump stat, and you can't really dump anything else. I mean, you could, but it won't be as optimal as you might like. We do really want to prioritize damage, penetration, finesse, and first target. They all do kind of need to be pretty high. It's one of the unfortunate truths of the Catachan knives. They just are very kind of modifier reliant. But if you get a somewhat decent roll, you can kind of make up for it with blessings and perks. Speaking of perks, I like to take flak damage and weak spot damage for the Catachan knives because you are really going to be benefiting a lot from those modifiers of finesse and first strike. So having that extra weak spot damage is really nice, combined with flak armor. For the blessings, there's actually quite a few blessings you can run on the Catachan knives, and I'm sure I will get some hate in the comments for running Lacerate and Mercy Killer. This is just how I think the easiest way to run the knives is, because you don't need to put a whole lot of thought into it. You just kind of throw out your light attacks and heavy attacks and just try to hit weak spots as best you can, but you will miss often enough that Lacerate will apply fairly regularly. For alternative blessings, we have quite a few options. One of my favorites is Uncanny Strike and Riposte. This is really good if you're not running Infiltrate, because getting behind targets will be a little bit more difficult. So running Riposte for that extra crit and Uncanny Strike for the rending means that you're going to be able to murder whatever's in front of you fairly easily, especially using the Mark III Catachan knife. For the other combination I like is Ruthless Backstab and Riposte. I feel like this is more of an Infiltrate style of build where you get that threat reduction, you get the invisibility, and you're able to kind of just go behind targets and start slashing. You actually will do a pretty absurd amount of damage with this kind of combination in mind, and I think this is a really good way to run the combat knife. Now, both of these marks do have drastically different movesets, so let's go ahead and look at those so you can see which moveset you prefer. Starting out, we have the Catachan Mark III combat knife. This is the original one, the one that's been in the game since the release, and its moveset is going to take a little bit of explaining. Its light attack pattern is going to be a couple of horizontal slashes followed up by a stab, and then another couple of horizontal slashes. So it's 3 to 4 horizontal slashes followed up by that single stab. This isn't going to matter too much, because usually when you're dealing with like chaff enemies, you just kind of spam it, throw in a push block attack, let him bleed to death. Like I can, well, that guy got crit a few times, but if I just stab him a few times, he'll bleed to death, and I can move on. The heavy attacks are all going to be this strike down pattern, where you kind of stab directly in. It's one over your right shoulder and then comes in from the other side. This is going to be giving you most of your damage against elites. You're not going to use this against hordes because it has absolutely no penetration at all. It will not go through more than one enemy. But what will is the push block attack. When you push block and do this kind of downward chop, it will go through multiple enemies, as you can see there. I can also spawn in a few Poxwalkers so you can see. But with the push block, that downward swing, we're able to hit more than one enemy, and it really helps with dealing with hordes to throw in those push block attacks. Now, the knife has a lot of depth to it, and I can't go into it too much, or this video will end up being 2 hours long. But one combo I do want to mention is going to be a downward stab into a push block attack into another downward stab. This can come out very quick, as you can see, and it's a great way to get that damage stacking up against harder targets. So make sure you're using the push block attack a lot with both versions of the combat knife. So that's the Mark III. Let's look at the other one. This is the Mark VI Catachan combat knife, and it does have a very different moveset from the Mark III. As you can see with the light attacks, it's all vanguards and horizontal swings. There is no stab. This makes it a little bit better at going through hordes because it's going to hit more area and all that good stuff. The push block attack is actually a stab here. So instead of before where you'd be using that push block to basically horde clear, for this one you're going to be using that push mostly to just stagger the enemy so you can keep spamming those attacks. But the main difference is going to be in the heavy attacks. It does this horizontal slash. Now this can deal with hordes very well, but one thing to be aware of is in the attack pattern, the first two are wide sweeps that have a decent amount of cleave. They will go through enemies. So you get this one and then the second one, but the third attack in the chain is going to be a strike down stab. So that's kind of the balancing act with this knife, is knowing that if you do get that third attack, that stab, it's not going to hit more than one enemy at a time. You also have, I forgot to mention this with the Mark III, but the special weapon attack for the knives is a punch. It's just a quick punch, which has some hilarious potential in games if you just want to like bully a Poxwalker to death. But what the punch does is it lets you enable that downward stab attack. So after you do the punch, your next light attack will actually be that heavy attack pattern where it'll stab downwards. This can come in some pretty handy, especially with the Mark VI, because it's wow, getting real fancy with it. But since that downward stab is a little harder to come by, otherwise you need to go through the whole attack pattern to get to it. If you want to deal with something like a crusher, it's easier to just spam the punch followed up with the stab than it is to go through the motions here, because the other two attacks are not going to do nearly as much damage. So yeah, that's the combat knives. Next up is going to be the Catachan swords, which, hilariously enough, they also think are knives. Devil's Claw swords occupy an interesting niche in Darktide, and it's all because of their special weapon ability. The ability to parry enemies, so block an attack and return an attack with extra strength on it, is extremely useful, and even though these swords are not great at killing elite enemies or bosses, the ability to parry every enemy in the game, you can even parry things like a downward attack from a Mauler or a Crusher, and return with a very damaging strike, is something no other weapon in Darktide can do, so that kind of gives the Devil's Claw swords a nice little niche to occupy. For modifiers, both the Mark IV, or all the Mark IV, the Mark VII, and the Mark I, they all share the same modifiers, being damage, cleave targets, cleave damage, finesse, and mobility, with mobility or cleave targets being our dump stat. We can dump cleave targets because we can offset the negative impacts of that with blessings, so if we take Wrath or Sweeping Strike, then cleave targets is not going to matter that much. As to the perks, we're going to run the same perks on all of them, being flak damage and elite damage. This is because the Devil's Claw swords are particularly good at cleaving through mixed hordes. They're not great at dealing with armored targets like I mentioned earlier, but if you have a bunch of ragers mixed in with a horde, the Catachan Devil's Claws are going to be great at dealing with those kinds of situations. So to buff up that strength, we're going to be taking flak damage and elite damage as our perks, and for our blessings, we're going to be taking Rampage and Wrath. These blessings are really going to complement that playstyle or that role of dealing with big hordes of enemies, whether they're just poxwalkers or they're, mixed groups. By throwing in extra parries and things like that, we can really make this weapon do some pretty incredible things. For alternative blessings, we have a couple of options. One other alternative combination I like to run, especially on the Mark I Devil's Claw, which is much more of a dedicated anti-horde weapon, we can go with Skull Crusher and Hammer Blow, relying on the horizontal swings of the Mark I to kind of stack up that stagger and apply that extra damage buff against all the enemies we've staggered. And then we have Shred, which is just a generally nice damage boost, where if you're running more of a crit-oriented build, having Shred is going to be good because it's, giving you 20% crit. The Devil's Claw swords, they do have a decent crit modifier. They're not like Attack Axe or a Knife, but, if you prefer running a lot of crit, Shred is a viable alternative option. So now that we've covered the blessings and the perks, let's look at the moveset. First of the Devil's Claw swords, we have the Mark IV. This is my favorite variant, mostly because of its moveset. It has, for its light attacks, a mixture of vanguards and horizontal attack patterns, and as you can see, the attack pattern goes on for a while before it resets, but all the attacks are a mixture of vanguard and horizontal swings. But what really makes this mark particularly good for the Devil's Claw is its heavy attack. So the first heavy attack is going to be this downward slash that does a whole bunch of damage, especially if you hit weak spots with it. The second attack is going to be a horizontal swipe, which is going to be great for horde clear. So the way that we make use of this is using our heavy attack to deal with harder targets, and we can animation cancel that heavy attack into more heavy attacks by using our parry. Another option you can do if you have stamina to spare, you can go for a heavy attack into a push block attack, which is also that kind of downward swipe, and then you can mix in animation cancels or full parries if you need to. Lastly, to deal with chaff enemies, you're going to be going light attack into a heavy attack and just kind of repeating this. You can spam light attacks if you find you need to make space for yourself, but when you're looking to kill hordes, especially mixed hordes, this is how you do it. Throw in that one light attack followed up by a heavy attack. So, before we get into the next marks of Devil Claw swords, let's talk about parries. So if you ever wanted to channel your inner Dark Souls player while you're playing Darktide, the Catachan swords are the ones for you. As you can see, the parry lets you block an attack and follow it up with a very devastating follow-up hit. This can be a little tricky to get down, it does take some practice, but once you know the attack patterns of the enemies that you're going to use it against, I was going to die there if I didn't dodge, but once you know the attack patterns and the timings, it's pretty easy to get down, and you do need to make use of the parry to get the most out of these swords. This is shared between all the combat marks, so I'm not going to mention it in the future marks, but I just wanted y'all to know and see how it works. So now let's look at the next mark, the Mark VII. Here we have the Mark VII Devil's Claw, and it has a little bit of a different attack pattern from the Mark IV, in that its light attacks are 2 vanguards into a downward strike. A downward strike is very nice for making your way through elite enemies. As you can see, the light attacks barely do any damage except for that downward strike, whereas the heavy attack pattern is a horizontal sweep followed up by a vertical strike down. So it's kind of the opposite of the Mark IV in that regard. So the only problem, the main reason I don't like the Mark VII nearly as much, is getting to that downward swing to actually do damage to like carapace can be pretty challenging. You have to get the sword to swing to the right side and then use it, or go through the first heavy attack to get to that second heavy attack. You can't do the same animation cancel that you could do with the Mark IV. For the push block attack, we have a stab, which can be pretty useful for tagging elite enemies, but other than that, I'm not a huge fan of this mark. I'm sorry if this is your favorite mark. It's just hard to feel inspired by it because the attack patterns are just kind of the opposite of what I want. But yeah, that's the Mark 7. Next up, we'll look at the Mark 1. Rounding out the Catachan Devil's Claws, we have the Mark 1. This is probably the best horde clearing variant of the Devil's Claw, so if that's what you're looking to take these weapons for, this is probably the mark for you. For its light attacks, we have a mixture of vanguards and a downward strike. As you can see, it repeats itself a lot faster than the Mark IV does, which can be kind of nice because when you're spamming these light attacks, getting that heavy hit in is going to be very useful, especially because on the Mark I, the heavy attacks are all these horizontal swings, which are not going to do well against armored targets. This is why I say that this weapon is primarily a horde clearing weapon. You can still kill things like maulers by using the parry, and heavy attacks. It's just going to take a while to make it work. For the push block attack, we have a Vanguard Slice, which is again extremely useful when you're dealing with hordes. So what you're going to be wanting to do is mixing in a combination of the heavy attacks with the push block attacks when you're clearing hordes, and using light attacks to make space for yourself if needed. But I wouldn't recommend using the Mark I if you're trying to deal with harder targets like maulers or crushers. It also does not do very good damage to bosses. But it can kill unarmored targets and flak armored targets pretty well with those heavy swipes. The parry is the same, and yeah, I think that's it for the Devil's Claw swords. Next up, we're going to be looking at my favorites, the shovels. The only exclusive melee weapon available to the veteran class is the Munitorum Sapper Shovels. For the marks, we have the standard issue, the Mark III, and the Mark VII, with the Mark III and the Mark VII being rather new additions to the game. The standard issue still has a place, and it's still a very good weapon, but it is a little bit overshadowed by the other two because it lacks their special weapon ability, which we'll talk more about in the moveset showcase right after this part. But for the modifiers, they all share the same modifiers, being damage, penetration, defenses, mobility, and first target. Usually our dump stat will be mobility, but if you're using the standard issue Munitorum Sapper Shovel, you can dump first target. It's not as important as it is with the other two, because first target really helps with the weapon's special ability. But if you're not planning on using that special ability very often, you can dump first target if you'd rather have that mobility be higher. Since all the shovels have pretty radically different movesets, we're going to go through these one by one. So for the standard issue shovel, I think that going for flak damage and unarmored damage to maximize your ability to deal with hordes is going to serve you best, and we can augment the weakness against elite enemies by using Take a Swing for 60% weak spot damage for 3 seconds after we push an enemy, and Uncanny Strike to give us rending on those weak spot hits. Both of these blessings work really well in concert to make the standard issue shovel a pretty beastly weapon, even if it is overshadowed by its more modern cousins. For the Mark III and the Mark VII, there are different blessing types you can take. The ones I would recommend for the Mark III are Carapace and Flak, and same thing for the Mark VII. We're going to use the same perks for both. For the blessings, on the Mark III, I really like Thrust because the special attack, it's just a little bit smoother than the Mark VII, so it's a little bit easier to get those thrust stacks in without causing yourself to be stuck in the mob for too long. And I like to pair that with Skull Crusher because all the shovels have pretty high innate stagger, and so getting that extra 80% damage, because it's 4 stacks of 10% up to 8 stacks, is just going to make it maul through pretty much anything in the game. And I think you'll actually be very surprised if you've never run the shovel before, because I would put it right up there with the Powersword as far as like ability to deal with a variety of targets. For alternative blessings, we have a couple of options, but my favorite combination is Hammer Blow and Skull Crusher. I already mentioned Skull Crusher giving you that absurd damage boost of up to 80% damage against staggered opponents, and with the veteran class specifically, this works really well with Voice of Command, because you shout everything down, they're all staggered, they're all taking that extra damage, and you just murder through everything. And with impact on there as well, you can even stagger things like Dreg Ragers and Crushers with it. So this is a very good blessing combination to use. Otherwise, you can just mix and match with the ones that we've already talked about. So now that we've covered the perks and the blessings, let's look at the moveset because they are very different for each weapon. We're going to start out with the standard issue Munitorum Sapper Shovel. I really like this one, even though it's a little bit outdated, because it's kind of a combination of an axe and a sword. What I mean by that is the light attack patterns are vanguards with one horizontal sweep at the end, and the heavy attacks are these big wide sweeps, but they still come out pretty quickly. And then the push block attack is a downward strike, so it kind of has an answer for everything. For instance, if you're just chopping into regular elites, it's pretty easy to just light attack them to death, but you can throw in these heavy attacks for more stagger, and it is better at doing a little bit of horde clear. We can even chop down carapace armor with this if we have that uncanny strike blessing on it. Lastly, the special attack is kind of like the antax. You're just stabbing forward into the thing's head. And if you hit it in the weak spot, it will stagger it. I'm not sure about bosses, but it will do it for maulers and crushers. So it's a good one to keep in your pocket. It really can save your life if you're about to get bonked and you just really need a quick way out of it. So that's the standard issue shovel. Next up, let's look at the Mark III, which is my favorite. Next up, we have the Munitorum Mark III Sapper Shovel. For this one, the light attack pattern is going to be mostly vanguards and horizontals, so it starts off with a vanguard into 2 horizontal attacks. For the heavy attack, you get 1 vanguard followed up by 1 downward strike, and then for the push block attack, you're going to get another horizontal swipe. So what this means is the light attack pattern is really good at dealing with hordes, especially when mixed in with the push block attack. You can just keep things away from you forever, and with the impact and Skull Taker blessings, you can really do a lot of damage to things that are staggered. So this is one of the reasons I like this axe. Now let's get to the thing that's special about it. This ability to flick the shovel down into an axe head. The light attack on this is great. You can hit breakpoints with it. That was a crit. Usually it'll take more than 1 hit to kill something like that. But the heavy attack is amazing for killing carapace armor, because you can flick it back into place pretty quickly. There's not really a delay. And as you can see, even with a crusher, I don't have thrust or anything like that on. I'm running stagger blessings, and I can still kill this in 2 hits. I don't even have to hit it in the head for the second one. Well, I guess I was wrong. But still, you can see how powerful it is. The same is going to be true for the Mark VII, so let's go ahead and look at that one next. For the last of the shovels, we have the Munitorum Mark VII. This one is also a really good option. That's kind of what I like about the shovels. None of them are bad. They all have their place. But the Mark VII, what differs is the attack pattern slightly. We have more horizontals, a vanguard, and a strike down. The extra strike down is nice to have in the kit because it's really easy to hit those heads with it. The push block is the same as the standard issue, where you're kind of doing this downward strike hit, which again is going to do a lot of damage to things like armor. And you can see here, just 3 hits the mauler with it. But the main difference is in the special attack. So with the special attack, the light version is a little bit better, and it will end up killing things like gunners in 1 hit if you stack up your blessings. You can see even with carapace armor, it's doing a lot of damage. Weirdly, the heavy attack version doesn't seem to hit as hard. It does hit a little bit harder, but for how slow it is, and as you can see, it gets stuck in the target briefly. It's probably easier to see on a crusher. But the heavy attack, there's that delay. It's kind of like a chainsword. So instead of using the heavy attack like you would expect, I kind of like just using the light attack and using it to boost up that rending, because as you can see, after just a few hits, we can kill him very, very quickly. But that's all the combat shovels, so let's get to the Powerswords. Both marks of the Powersword are incredibly strong, the Mark VI and the Mark III. They're probably the best generalist weapon in the entire game for any class. They can kill any target as long as you're using the energized attack, and with the right blessings and perks, it truly becomes a monster of a weapon. We're talking cleaving through hordes of ragers, killing crushers in 2 shots, the whole works. But for the modifiers, we have damage, finesse, cleave targets, and mobility. Now here you have a little bit of a choice. You can dump cleave targets. We can make up for that with a blessing if we want to. Typically I like to dump mobility though, because I just feel like with the power sword, I'm more waiting for the enemy to come to me than I am running to go and chop heads. So in the interest of keeping it kind of a more defensive weapon, you can, you know, sacrifice a little bit of mobility. But if you really want to just go ham, you can sacrifice cleave targets and be a little bit faster. For perks, I like to run Carapace and Flak damage because, that's mostly what you're going to have trouble cleaving through anyway. And since the energized attacks just go through hordes like butter, I don't feel like we really need to take anything else. You can swap one of these out for unyielding damage if you want to make it into more of a boss killing weapon. The Mark 6 is a little bit better at that role, but they both can kind of do it. For the blessings, this is where we have a little bit more choice, but at the same time, not. Power Cycler is kind of a mandatory blessing on the Power Sword. You can run without it. It's okay if you don't have the blessing. It's not like you're going to be a detriment to your team or anything, but you're really missing out on a lot of the cool combos and just killing power that the Power Sword has. So Power Cycler is a bit of a must, but again, if you don't have it, feel free to swap something else out until you get it. And it's also okay if you just have Power Cycler 3. You just really need those 2 energized attacks to make use of most of the combos available to you. And I'll show you those right after this part. So for alternate blessings, we do have a couple that we can consider instead of Rampage. That's the other one that we're going to be taking with Power Cycler because, we're almost always going to be cleaving through more than 3 targets, so it's going to be up most of the game, which is why I like to take it. But you can also take Slaughter. It's perfectly fine. It's a very good blessing. It will give you more raw power most of the time. It just takes a little bit of time to ramp up because you actually have to kill the target. And then the other option we have is Sunder. This is a kind of a hidden gem of a blessing because what it allows you to do is you can chop through like bulwark shields with it. It will go through multiple crushers. It just turns it into the ultimate cleave weapon. There's not really a better weapon at cleaving through stuff than a power sword with Sunderer on it. So those are some options you can consider. Now let's go look at some of those combos you can do with this weapon and just the general move patterns. The Mark 6 Power Sword has a really diverse moveset, which is why I like it a lot. I don't run this weapon often, but it's mostly because I'm a little bit tired of it. I've run it so much because it is a lot of fun. But, there's a big arsenal in this game, and you might as well check out a few of them. But if you're a big Power Sword lover or you want to see how it works, this is the moveset. So for the light attacks, we're looking at horizontals, a vanguard, and a downward strike. The heavy attacks are these vanguard-style hits with one coming from above and one coming from below. And the push block attack is a stab. Now with the energized, there are a few different combinations you can do. You can just kind of walk forward and slash through things, which, perfectly reasonable. But if you're up against something like a mauler, this can take all 3 hits. But if you energize it, go for the push block stab into that downward follow-up attack, it can kill them in 2. So this is a very useful combination to know. And as you can see, even if you miss the stab, you can still kill them in 3 hits anyway. This also applies to maulers. So if you go for the push block stab, you can kill them in 2 hits. I don't have a bit. This isn't a build that's just designed to do this. This is pretty easy to accomplish with some perks and blessings. You can see my power sword on the screen now. But yeah, we'll be talking about talents and stuff like that in the next guide. Next up, we have the Mark III Power Sword. We'll finish off part 1 of this guide with the Munitorum Mark III Power Sword. This weapon has Vanguard-style light attacks, which is really easy to use and very good for hitting heads and dealing with hordes. We have the heavy attack pattern, which is a horizontal slash back and forth, and then we have the push block, which is a vertical strike down. Of these, one to notice is the vertical strike down. As with most weapons, is going to be really good at dealing with heavy armor or even just elite enemies as long as you're hitting them in the head. It'll do a lot of damage. Like for instance, on this Ogren, it's going to take him 3 hits to kill him. Crusher. But yeah, so even without Power Cycler, these weapons can still be extremely effective, and I don't know, if you haven't tried them out already, I hope you give them a shot, because they are probably a little bit too strong, but hey, they're a lot of fun. If you've made it to the end of this video, then congratulations. This has been a long one, much longer than I usually do for my guides. But I hope you've learned something about some kind of weapon that the Darktide veteran has access to. There's a lot of really good choices out there, and it's really fun to kind of mix things up. So if you've been playing with the same melee weapon for a long time, I hope this has inspired you to pick up something new and give it a shot, because for me, that's one of the most fun aspects of this game, is just finding the most efficient and brutal ways to massacre heretics. Coming up, there will be a part 2 where we're going to go over all the ranged weapons, blessings, perks, and all that good stuff. And then part 3, we're going to look at talents and how to design builds, or at least how I do it. So I hope you'll stay tuned for that, and yeah, get out there and slay some heretics. Caiaphas, out.